So, I married my wife at the age of 26. And I remember it was less than a year after being married, she came to me and she told me she feels like Jesus is calling her back. She had watched a YouTube video, and it was this music video that basically shared the gospel message. And after watching that video, she told me she felt like Jesus is calling me back. Now, she grew up in a Christian home, but she had kind of been pulled away from the church. She wasn't going to church. She didn't really interact with people from the church. And I grew up in a non-Christian home. In my home, my family was loving, but one of the things we never talked about was God. We never brought up God. We never mentioned God. We did have Bibles under our bed, but that was about as far as we went. Didn't even bring it up. Didn't even know what the Bible said. And so when my wife tells me this, I had actually already broken up with a girlfriend prior to this for trying to convert me to Christianity. But I was already married to this woman, and I loved this woman. And so I figured I would go ahead, I would go to church with her, let her get it out of her system, she'd get over it, and we'd be able to move on. Well, we went to church, and one of the things I always noticed as a non-believer, because growing up in that home, I tend to lead more towards atheism, because the only Christian interactions that I really interacted with were the guys on the street corners downtown with the megaphones yelling that I'm going to hell. And I would see all this hypocrisy in the church, and I didn't want anything to do with Christians. But it was ironic because I went to church with her, and I actually got a different experience. I looked around at the congregation, and I saw all of these people that were genuine. They seemed to really believe this. And so I thought to myself, okay, I see. It gives them something to put their hope in. It's just not actually true. I don't want anything to do with it. So I went with her a few times, and over time, I decided I didn't want to go to church anymore. I was over it. It didn't go out of her system. She was still persistent. And so I figured all I have to do is disprove Christianity, show her that it's false, and then I wouldn't have to deal with any of this anymore. And so I pulled up documentaries going over atheism. Have any of you seen the documentary by Bill Maher he basically goes and makes fun of Christians and then points out the flaws and contradictions within Christianity. So I would show her that documentary. And then I went to another documentary called Zeitgeist. You ever seen that one? Another documentary trying to disprove Christianity. And I would show her, like, see, it's just not real. There's no reason to believe it. But she was still persistent.
But one of the things I noticed is I started actually digging a little bit further than just those surface level movies. I was reading books, I was listening to podcasts, and I found something called Christian apologetics, people giving a defense for the Christian faith. And these are smart, educated people that have come to the conclusion that it's actually true. And this is 3 years of me doing this. 3 years of me just reading books and podcasts and videos and digging more into it. And at the end of the 3 years, I started hitting my wife with so many questions that she wasn't able to answer. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Whoa, I can't answer them. You're not gonna hinder my faith, but I can't answer these hard questions. Instead, I have a friend of the family you can go and talk to." So she sent me to this friend of the family. His name was Tom. And I remember I wrote down 5 pages full of questions for this guy. And I was just ready to hammer. These were questions about angels and demons and hell and heaven and the resurrection and all this ridiculous stuff that's in the Bible. And I remember at the end of the conversation, keep in mind, this is 3 years of me looking into this. At the end of the conversation, he had answered every single one of my questions. And he sat there and looked at me. And he said, "Do you believe it?" And I wasn't going to say no. I had no more objections. There was nothing else that I could raise and oppose to what he had answered. And I said, "I think I do, but I don't think it really impacted me until the drive home." On the drive home was the moment where I finally realized there are good arguments for this. This really is the best explanation for reality. And what's holding me back? And I realized at that moment it wasn't the evidence that was holding me back, because the evidence was there. It was the fact that I didn't want it to be true. And so I threw my arms up and I said, "Okay, Jesus, I believe it. Here's my life. What's next?" And it's funny because I always looked at Christians as being narrow-minded. That they only had this one way, this one truth, and everything else they just had blinders on, and they weren't open to hearing any other perspectives. That's always my view of Christianity, or Christians. And at that moment, it was almost like blinders finally came off my eyes, and I was actually able to see reality for the way that it actually is. And I wish I could go back and kind of explain that experience a little deeper, because that feeling, I went from a moment of believing that this is all true to knowing that this is all true. And I think at that moment what it was the inner witness of the Holy Spirit finally affirming to me that this is actually true. So I went home, and my wife's sitting on the couch, and I go over there and I sit next to her, and she's like, she's staring at me. She's like, so how did the conversation go? I said, well, I think I actually believe it. I gave my life to Jesus. She got super excited. She gave me a hug. She handed me this necklace that she had been holding on to for 6 months, because I think she had a feeling she knew I was getting my answers. My questions were getting answered. And I was on fire for Jesus. I was reading the scriptures and finally understanding it and soaking it all up and super excited. But one of the things that I wasn't excited about was telling people I'm a Christian, or sharing Jesus with anyone. Because what if they ask me a question I don't know? Or what if they view me different? Or what if my family views me differently? Or what if I just can't formulate the words or can't explain the gospel right? And so I was scared, I was hesitant. And then something happened that really impacted my life. My grandmother was passing away, and my dad called me and he said, we need to go to the hospital because they're about to pull blood and let her pass. And so I went to the hospital, and it was my dad and my two aunts. And they looked at me and they said, whatever you do, don't tell her that she's passing away, or don't tell her that we're going to pull the plug, because we don't want her to panic or get upset. And in my head, I just felt this like sunkenness in my soul. Like, what do you mean you're not going to tell her that she's passing away? How could you not tell someone that their life is about to end? And keep in mind, with my family, like I said, they all said they believed in God. But I never heard anyone talk about Jesus, anyone talk about the gospel, anyone talk about what the Bible actually said. And so I go in, and my grandmother's sitting there, and she's conscious, she's talking to everyone, and a chaplain walks by. And the chaplain takes his head and he says, would you like me to pray for you? And she didn't know what was going on. She said, what for? What do you need to pray for me for? And he realized that we hadn't told her, so he went, he's like, oh, we're just going around and praying for people. And so he walked up, and we all got in a circle, and my whole family said the Lord's Prayer. And I remember in my head, they must have learned this from childhood, because I've never heard them talk about Jesus. And in my head, I'm thinking, they don't know Jesus. They're just citing some words that they probably knew from being raised that way, or grew up hearing these words. And they pulled the plug. And I remember the last things my grandma said was, help me, because she didn't understand what was going on. I had an opportunity to share the gospel, and I didn't. I didn't because I was afraid of what my family would say. I was afraid of going against what they said about not telling her that she was dying. And I don't know if she passed away not knowing Jesus. And that impacted me so much that now I don't hesitate. Every opportunity I get to talk about Jesus, I don't care if it's the sales guy coming to my door. I don't care if it's the guy in line with me at the grocery store. I don't care if it's the guy changing my oil. Within 5 minutes of the conversation, I will bring up Jesus. And I will share the gospel. And I will answer the hard questions that they had. Or that they had because I've been there. I know what those hard questions are. So, here's my question to you. Before I do that, I actually want to read this because I think this is important. This sums up my experience. The Lord is near to all who call on him. To all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He also hears their cry and saves them. I think if we actually look, we're going to find answers. And I'm afraid that that's what people today don't do. I think we're too distracted. We're too busy about work, we're too busy about school, we're too busy about the next text message or the next thing we have to do, the next thing on the agenda, that we're not thinking about the deeper questions of life. And we tend to just skim over, and so therefore we never really seek Jesus. And how are we going to find him if we don't seek him? So, here's my question. Why do you believe? When I became a believer, I just assumed that Christians knew this stuff. I assumed they all spent 3 years investigating it to make sure it's true before giving their life to something. But I learned that that's not actually true. When I have interactions with Christians, there are three most common answers that I get for why they believe. They were raised Christian, they have faith, or they had an experience. While these are legitimate reasons, an experience can genuinely put real faith, real faith towards Jesus, just based on one of these. But my problem is, if you give this answer to any non-believer, specifically myself as an atheist, I don't care if you're raised Christian. I believe your faith is blind. I believe you have no good reason. To me, the word faith means blind faith, believing something where there's no good reason to believe it. And I don't believe in your experience. So what else you got? This is the response of most non-believers. They're not going to believe in your experience. I think if we really need to figure out what their objections are and what their answers are, here's why I believe Christianity and I believe in Christ because it's the best explanation of reality. It's the best explanation for the origins of the universe. It's the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. It's the best explanation for the origins of life. It's the best explanation for the existence of evil. It's the best explanation for the reliability of Scripture. It's the best explanation for the facts surrounding the resurrection. And I know Jesus personally. I wait until the end on that because that is the least compelling thing to someone else. And so what I want to do first is I want to address reasons why I actually believe this stuff. Because it's not blind. There are good reasons to believe it. The origins of the universe, there's something called a cosmological argument for the existence of God. It's anything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. When we look at that, we know that all science, the majority of scientists today agree the universe had a beginning. But it's not just the matter of the universe that had a beginning. It's space and time itself that had a beginning. So the universe can't cause itself. Whatever caused the universe must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and it has to choose to create it, so it's got to be personal. The fine-tuning of the universe, when we look out at just how many parameters have to be exactly right in order for us to be here, is beyond impossible. There's a video that I watched that really started to pique my interest as a non-believer during this journey. And it was a video that I watched that actually compelled me to look a little bit deeper into Christianity. Because I was just taking slogans. You can't have an all-good, all-loving God and have the existence of evil. I would see slogans like evolution is disproving Christianity. All of these slogans would pop up. So I never really looked deeper. Until this video popped up. I forget the title of it, but I think it was Atheist Turns Christian, Scientific Evidence for God. And it was a video of a guy named Hugh Ross going over his perspective of the creation days. And I remember from his perspective, this wasn't incompatible with Christianity. In fact, the scientific evidence points to the existence of God. And so that piqued my interest. I said, well, maybe there is something to this. And that's when I would read books and videos. And keep in mind, I didn't read books before this. I could care less about books. And I invest everything I had into searching it. It's the best explanation for the origins of life. We don't have a good naturalistic explanation for the origins of how life arose. We have, in the science textbooks, you have the methane pool possibly bringing up life, right? But there's no actual evidence for that. And you can't explain the origins of the information in DNA based on that. It's the best explanation for the existence of evil. If anything in this reality is actually evil, actually evil, that means there must be something that's actually good. Because what is evil? Evil isn't a particular thing, it's a lack of good things. And if there's something that's actually good, then we have to have a standard of how we can measure what's good. And how do we have a standard of what's good without God? Therefore, evil, far from disproving Christianity, actually proves that there is a God out there, and there is an ultimate good, an ultimate standard of good and evil out there. It's the best explanation for the reliability of Scripture. When I read this book, I remember talking to my wife and I said, there's no way this is true. This was written by how many men over thousands of years ago? How do I know that this book that I'm reading today is actually what was written down 2,000 years ago? It's been corrupted, it's been changed. It's just like the telephone game. One guy told one guy this, and it's changed, and today it could be something completely different than what was originally written down. But I didn't know that there was actual manuscript evidence out there. When you look at the manuscripts for Scripture, you've got about 5,800 manuscripts in Greek and Hebrew alone and 22,000 in other languages. You look at any other historical figure and they do not compare, not even close. And so what they do is, I learned that they take the older manuscripts that we've discovered with the newer manuscripts and they compare them, and it turns out, far from being different, it's 99.5% correct and exactly the same. And that 0.5% of variants that are out there, they don't change any significant meaning, any significant doctrine. And then the facts surrounding the resurrection. The majority of even atheist and agnostic scholars will agree on certain facts about Jesus. That he was an actual historical figure, that he did die on the cross by crucifixion, that his number of his disciples and other eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the risen Jesus after the fact. And when you lay all of the evidences out there, the facts that we have, the best explanation for it is the actual resurrection. But any other explanation there just doesn't fit. For example, the disciples, they fled when Jesus died, right? They were scared their Messiah that they didn't think was going to die actually died. And so they wanted to flee. So something happened to them where they completely changed their mind. And rather than fleeing, they gave their lives for what they believed. And you have people every day now giving their lives every day. You have people giving their lives today for things that they believe to be true, right? People flying planes into towers. But the difference is these disciples would have known it to be false because they were there. They would have known he didn't rise from the dead. They had already fled. So what was it that changed their perspective completely to end up giving their lives? They would have given their lives for a known lie. And then again, I know Jesus personally. I have an actual relationship with him. I talk to him. I experience the truth that comes from Scripture and the words that he uses. To think of this guy as a mere man is beyond impossible. You think of the kind of claims that he made, and have any of you ever read the book Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace? Got one guy. Okay. All of you need to read the book. J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective, and he basically did a cold case investigation on the resurrection. And in this cold case investigation, one of the things that he pointed out that really impacted me was the fact that you have this guy from 2,000 years ago
with no money, no real royalty, only 3 years of ministry, and yet somehow this guy
has impacted the entire course of human history. He's the most talked about person, the most sung about person,
the most written about person, the most sculpted person in the course of human history, period. No one has made an impact as drastically as this one figure of history did. And how do you explain that? So when you go to share with other people, one of the things that, like I said before, I was hesitant about is I was afraid that I was going to be asked questions that I don't know. And that's going to happen. There's been lots of conversations I've had where it has just gone downhill. And I got hit with something that I had no clue, and I would try to fumble something together and get an answer, and I would just respond. And what I did was I just pushed them away. If you don't know the answer to something, it's okay to say you don't know it. But you need to go and figure out what the answer is. And if you have a chance to follow up with them, you need to go back to them and try to answer that objection that they originally had. And if you don't, I guarantee you the next time you're asked that question, you'll know how to answer it. And over time, with doing this, you'll get to a point to where you are able to answer those difficult questions. Most of the questions that people raise are questions that I had as a non-believer. And so I've experienced these questions. There's a few ways that you can do this. And has anyone read the book Tactics by Greg Koukl? Oh, I got a few more. Okay, that's another book. Okay, 2 books on your list. A Person of Interest and Tactics by Greg Koukl. Tactics is a way to use questions to advance the conversation when you're talking with non-believers, or even believers for that sake. Because, for example, I had a guy come up to my door that was trying to sell roofing, and he had a cross necklace on. And so he walks up, and I was like, no, I don't want any roofing or anything like that, but can I ask you a personal question? He said, of course. I said, I see you're wearing a cross. Are you a Christian? He said, oh, yeah, I'm a Christian. I said, okay, well, why do you believe all that stuff? Because I'm going at it my atheist self. I want to see his reaction. He said, oh, I just do. I was raised that way, and that's just what I believe. And I said, okay, well, what do you believe about Jesus? He said, oh, yeah, I believe in Jesus. I said, okay, what do you believe about Jesus? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm not one of those Christians. Like, I don't go to church on Sundays and stuff. and I don't really invest a whole lot into all this religious aspect of it. And so I told him, I said, "Do you know what you just did?" I said, "I'm a Christian, and basically what you just told me is that you're too ashamed to admit your belief in Jesus and why you believe it. Why would you be ashamed in that? This is the most important question we can possibly ask about the most important historical figure, and yet you just don't know. You just believe it." And one of the things that I noticed he didn't even have was he didn't even properly understand the gospel. So never assume that someone is a Christian just because they have a cross necklace or because they say they believe in God. Another guy I ran into, I asked him the same questions. I said, "What do you believe about God?" He said, "Oh yeah, I believe in God." "Okay, great. What do you believe about Jesus?" "Oh, I believe in Jesus too." I said, "Great, but what do you believe about Jesus?" "Oh yeah, I get it now. I'm a Jehovah's Witness." I said, "Okay, so there's my answer. Now I know what I need to address, and that's the deity of Jesus." We won't know what their objections are until you use questions to figure out what they are. You could be dealing with someone who thinks there's no evidence. You could be dealing with someone who thinks that they had some kind of terrible experience with Christians or the church, or they've been hurt by the church. You could be dealing with someone who just went through a terrible suffering and they can't understand why God would allow something like this to happen in their life. You don't know what the objection is until you ask them questions. And one of the ways you can do this is you can use questions like, "What do you mean by that?" So if they say, "Well, science is incompatible with Christianity," well, what do you mean by that? You say, "Well, I've heard that, I saw it somewhere, and we know that science has disproven it." Well, another question you can ask, well, how did you come to that? Because now they got to think, what is their evidence for supporting that it's disproven Christianity? They have to think back, and they have to justify what their answer is. And I guarantee that most of them haven't really thought about this, because they haven't invested enough time to think about it. That was my problem. My problem was I didn't care to look that far into it. If you actually are in search for the answers, they are there and you can find them. And then you could always use, have you ever considered? Have you ever considered that science isn't incompatible with Christianity? In fact, the majority of aspects of science actually point to the existence of God. And you could say, here, let me show you a couple. You go over the cosmological argument, which is the origins of the universe, and you could go over the teleological argument, which is the fine-tuning of the universe, and you can use these to answer whatever that objection is. And be genuinely interested. This is what I see. This frustrates me so much when I see Christians who are just either out to debate, out to prove someone wrong, out to just somehow call someone else out on the sin that they're in, when that person doesn't even understand that they're in sin. We need to be genuinely interested in the people, because all they are is lost people. And I'm talking about all people. I interact with Jehovah's Witnesses all the time that come to my door. And I don't say, "Close my door, I'm a Christian, you guys leave me alone." No, I open the door, I go out there, and I have a 2-hour conversation with them. Because they're just lost. When I'm talking to someone that I'm interacting with in the stores, I will just flat out ask them, "Can I ask you a personal question?" And I'll go straight into it. And I do it through questions because I want to seem genuinely interested in what they actually believe about reality. I want to dig into their belief system and help them to understand their own belief system, because most of them haven't. Most of them have built this belief system that they use pieces from other religions or pieces from different ideas and put something together that looks great for them. And you just believe what you want to believe. Your truth is good for you. My truth is good for me, and I'll just believe this. And they don't really dig into it. And it's kind of that complacency and just being comfortable with what they want to believe. But we're not just doing this because I want to. We're commanded to go and share the gospel. We're commanded to defend what we believe. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that's in you, yet with gentleness and respect." And the gentleness and respect is the hardest aspect of this, because conversations can get heated, and the opposing side or the person that you're talking to, they could get defensive, which causes you to get defensive. This is the hardest part of it, and the only thing I can say is that it takes practice of actually going out there and doing it. And you're going to fail at it, and you're going to be upset with yourself the first few times, and it's not going to go the way that you want to, but to not be discouraged and use that so that you can do better next time. And eventually you're going to get good at it. And the more you do it, the more you want to do it, the more you want to share Jesus. Because if this is actually true, why would I not want to tell everyone about it? When my grandma passed away in the hospital, I remember I walked out and I found that chaplain that prayed, and I talked to him, and I said, hey, I was too scared to share the gospel with my family. How come you didn't share it with her? Because he was there. Why didn't he share the gospel? And the words he said to me, everyone has their own beliefs. I have no place to say that their beliefs are wrong. I was mind blown by that statement, because if this is actually true, then their beliefs are false. They're just flat out not true. We need to seek what the truth is, and if this is actually true, we need to share the gospel. We need to be out there actually talking to people, and yeah, it's uncomfortable. It can be super uncomfortable, but it's necessary, and we're commanded to do it. And if we love Jesus, why not do what he commands? Since then, I've been a filmmaker for like 15 years now, and 7 years ago is when I gave my life to Christ. Just before I gave my life to Christ, I was preparing to do my first feature movie. I was finally going to put together a feature movie, and I grew up watching horror films because I love horror films. And that was what I was going to do. I was like, well, it's an easy way to make money. I know how to do it. I know how to scare people. I can make a horror film super easy, low budget, and do great with it. And then I gave my life to Christ, and I was like, oh, well, do I still do that? Or do I just, like, is that okay? And I struggled with it. And I just felt this conviction, like, no, you don't need to do that. What good is that going to do? If you're going to invest your life in something, what good is that going to do? And so I talked to my wife, and she's like, well, make a Christian film. I was like, I don't want to make a Christian film. They suck. and they do, like, the way that they're portrayed in this whole, like, everything else ends up great, or they're super, like, surface-level stuff, and it's not real life how things actually happen. And then she said, well, why don't you do a documentary given the evidences that you found? So I said, I'm going to do that. I put a bunch of money on credit cards, and I went and got some film equipment, and I emailed every single one of those guys that I read books on and watched podcasts on, not expecting any of them to respond, and they all responded and said yes. And so I went around interviewing all of these guys that I had read books on, and I got to sit down for 2 hours with each of these guys and ask them all the questions I had as a non-believer. So I'm putting together this documentary. I've been working on it for the past 2 years. My goal is to have it done within a year. But my hope is that this will be a resource that you can use when you get only about 5 minutes of a conversation with someone. And you can say, I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer your questions, but there's this great film that addresses a lot of the stuff that you have questions about. Here's a link to it. Here's a way to watch it. And you can send them to this resource. And not only that, it's for believers as well, because I'm afraid that we tend to kind of distance ourselves from just how important all of this is. I think it's so easy to get distracted and get on your phone, and next thing you know, 2 hours have gone by, and you're like, where the heck did the time go? What did I just waste my life doing? I feel like this is something that will get you excited again and get you ready to go and share the gospel, because the evidences are so powerful out there. And to hear testimonies from some of these scientists of why they gave their life to Christ based on science. And I think some of these testimonies are some of the most compelling things, and I try to present as many of the arguments as I can for the existence of God. And I'm doing it in a way that's targeting the non-believer. So this is not a film that would end up on some PureFlix site. My goal is for this to go to the secular, non-believing world, because that's who I want to address. I want people that were like me, that have the hard questions. I want them to have their questions answered, and I want them to know that Christianity is something that's actually logically plausible. You remember that video I told you I watched with Hugh Ross? I ended up getting to meet him. I interviewed him for the movie. So that guy that he impacted me, that one little video that just popped up on my YouTube, which I think is funny now, that God somehow used YouTube on my wife and I. Don't know how that worked. But I got to meet him. I got to interview him. And it was just an amazing experience. So I want to go ahead and show you guys. I did put together a trailer for the film, so you'll get to kind of see what it is. And let you guys watch that really fast. Ready?
When you look look at the expansion of the galaxies away from one another, you trace that back in time, and what you got is a singularity.
If you run time backwards, eventually you run into a boundary where space and time break down, the laws of physics cease, and there's a beginning.
And if time had a beginning, whatever created time must be timeless. In other words, something that's uncreated, something that's eternal, something we might call God.
The reason that we believe that God is true is because he's the best explanation for the way things are.
Everything is exactly right for life.
It forced me to ask the deep and difficult questions.
Who is this creator, and do I relate to that creator at all?
Has God made himself known?
Uh-oh. Well, there you go. Here, I'm going to try to hit play, see what that is.
I want to know
No.
What kind of impact has Jesus had?
In order to see if the Creator is the Christian
Well, there you go.
God, we have to see if Jesus rose from the dead.
And if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match.
So, that's my story. There's a link to the website for the movie if you want to follow it. I am going to have, thank you. I am going to have resources on there as well. So all of these topics that I talked about, all of these guys in the film have so many resources that are out there that you need to look at. And it's all on the website. You can go to the website, you can look at each scholar. Each scholar has their own resource page where there's classes and courses and all kinds of training that you can go through on there as well. But any questions? Yes?
When you approach someone, just like if I'm giving a conversation, how do you introduce Christ in that, to a stranger?
So I'm kind of odd. I only know how to talk about two things. I can talk about God, and I can talk about film. I'm not good with small talk. So when I'm talking to a person, I will flat out ask them, can I ask you a personal question? What do you believe about God? And I'll go straight into it. You can use different ways to kind of navigate the conversation. I tend to be pretty blunt because I feel like that really gets them thinking when you're just blunt and ask them and not trying to beat around the bush and navigate into this conversation. Now, I will say if they start trying to talk about topics that the scripture says is wrong, especially in this culture, I would navigate away from that and go straight to Jesus. Because if Jesus is actually who he said he was, then we can look at his word and see what it says about us in our life. And so let's focus on that rather than this other issue that you may have. Unless it's a case where they want to talk about that, and you can use that to share the gospel. There are tons of ways to navigate the conversation, but I tend to be pretty blunt. So. And I will say, if you prepare yourself, God will put people in your path. I interact with the non-believer at least twice a week. And it's random times. It's times I don't even expect it. Just like I said with the salesman coming to my door, for whatever reason, God sends a salesman to my door at least once a week. And all of them get the gospel message. So. Any other questions? Yes.
Have you ever had the opportunity to lead someone to Christ?
I have once. And even that was a false conversion. And it can be, one of the things that Greg Koukl says in his books is that our goal is to put a pebble in their shoe and to let God take it from there. And so the majority of the time when you do lead someone to Christ, they've already had tons of pebbles put in their shoe and they're ready. My goal, obviously, is going to be to share the gospel, and would be amazing to see them come to Christ, but I have to be okay with knowing that's probably not going to happen in these conversations. But you can put a stone in their shoe, you can get them thinking, and then you let God take it from there and trust that he will. Yes?
Michael, when you
recognized yourself as an atheist and you had hostility towards Christianity, or you just didn't have good feelings toward Christianity, what were like the top 3 or 4 beefs you had with Christianity? Biggest objections, things you had to think through, resolve before you were open?
My biggest objections were I thought Christians were idiots. I thought that there was no good reason to believe in a fairy tale guy in the sky. But mostly is because I had a false idea of what Christianity was. Another one was the way I was treated by Christians. Like I said, I would be downtown walking around and the guys with the megaphone are yelling at me, "I'm going to hell." And don't even really tell me why. They're just yelling at me. Rather than trying to share the actual gospel, they just are spouting stuff like that at me. And then I think when I looked at Christians and Christianity, I don't know, I saw it as just this belief system that's just like any other belief system, and there was no really good reason to believe it. And I wasn't one that was particularly hurt by other Christians, but I've heard testimonies of people that are genuinely being hurt by people in the church, and most of the time it's not even intentionally. It's not like we're out to hurt people, but a lot of times we do. And that's why I think it's important when you have conversations with them to let them know that you can't judge a belief system based on its abuse. Because if you're judging Christianity based on the way Christians act, well, then you're getting it all wrong. And the scriptures say that all of us are hypocrites. We're all going to fail at it. And so I think when they see us trying to put ourselves on a pedestal and make it seem like we're better than them because we've got a relationship with Jesus, they see that hypocrisy like that. I mean, they can call it out quicker than you probably can with your Christian friends. And so I think it's important for us to let them know we're still human, we're still broken, we make mistakes, but what was Jesus like? And what did Jesus say about that?
Apologetics books, there are these classic questions that they're trying to answer, the philosophy questions. How important were those questions to you? Like, how could there be a good God and there's evil, or can I trust the Bible, or is there even any evidence for God? Were those important questions to you, or kind of secondary issues for you?
At first, they weren't important at all because I didn't think there was any good answers to them. But when I actually looked and saw that there were good, particularly the problem with evil, right? Because one thing we all know, even as non-believers know, is we look around and there's something wrong with the world. There's something that's just not right. There's evil out there and it's terrible. And then worse, I always have this sense of guilt in me, like I'm not right. Something's broken in me. And I think we all inherently know that. And so when you're talking to non-believers, that's why I say it's important to ask questions, because their question could be the evidence, but it could also be the fact that they struggle with the idea of an all-loving, all-good God existing when their family member just died, right? How do you respond to that? Because if you just throw the logical reasons, well, if evil exists, then good must exist, and if good must exist, then God must exist, they don't want to hear that, right? So you have to empathize with them. Sometimes you just have to be a shoulder to cry on. One way that I tend to go about it is I let them know that we worship a God that's not some distant God, but we worship a God that has suffered alongside with us and in a way that we can't even experience, and we will never be able to comprehend. So he suffered with us. He's right there with us. He's not distant. And it says that we can lean in him in the suffering, in the midst of the suffering, and that all of this stuff that's happening in the world, what's crazy about Christianity is Christianity not only explains that there's evil, why there's evil, but it gives a solution to the evil. No other belief system does that. You look at naturalism, there can be no evil. If you believe in an atheistic worldview, well, then all that terrible stuff that's happened to you, I mean, it's just what happens. There's no reason to it. There's no meaning behind it. And yet, Christianity is the best explanation for it. But that's why it's important to use questions, because you never know what their objections are, and you have to be gentle with how you approach it. Yes?
I was in a conversation with somebody, and
one of their main objections was that that they were outcast by their church, and that also bad things have happened to people in their family. And so the fact that just the existence of that offense to their family is an objection to Christianity. How would you respond to that?
I would respond kind of similar to how I did before, where you can't judge a belief system based on its abuse. Because you take whatever experience they went through with that church, right? When you say they were outcast, what do you mean? How were they outcast?
So, because somebody was a part of the LGBTQ community in their family, he just used the word that they were not allowed to come anymore.
Not allowed to be in the church.
I don't know if it was not allowed or that because of the way, because he didn't specify how the church actually responded to that. He just said that they weren't like welcome there,
Right.
basically. And I don't know if that was because the church gave a genuine response to them,
Right,
and they
right.
just took that as, oh, you don't support this, so you're like throwing this out, that kind of thing. Or if the church actually was like hateful towards that.
Right,
So
right.
I don't know. He didn't specify that, but he did specify that they were not welcome.
I would try to
dig a little bit deeper before you respond, and figure out exactly like his reasons for leaving. Was it the way that they treated him? Was it the fact that they believed that? Was it just the idea that because the church doesn't accept it, they don't want to be a part of it? I would dig a little bit deeper to really figure out where their objection is, and then address whatever it is. So if it's the way the church is treating them, well then, I mean, the church is broken as well. And like I said, that's where you could do you can't judge a belief system based on its abuse. If it's the idea of the scriptures objecting to the LGBT idea or mindset, well then you would take them to the scriptures and say, what do you think it says? And sometimes the truth is not what we want to hear. It's just the truth.
And digging a little further with him, I found like because my natural response to that was to basically tell him how the church should have responded. And in the language, I distinguish between loving and affirming.
Yep.
And he was like, that was the problem he had, was that even though we love, we still do not affirm. So he was like basically questioning, why would you not affirm this? Like, why can't we do what we want to do or something like that?
Right, right.
So it's really the core, that was at the core of his objection.
I'll give you kind of an example of an experience that I had. I was in a rock band when I was growing up. And one of my friends that was in the band with me, he sent me a message on Facebook and wanted to meet up with me, and it had been 10 years since I saw this guy. And I went to meet up and have coffee with him, and you could tell he was like transitioning, wanting to become a female. And I remember the conversation. I went through and knowing me, I just went straight to God. I just started going into it and talking to him about it. And I shared the gospel with him. He said, I never understood the gospel that way. I always thought like you had to do something. And then the next time he met with me, he flat out asked me, what do you think about the LGBTQ community? Like he's ready for me to just give a response to that, right? And so I stopped him. I said, the scriptures seem to suggest that it's wrong. I said, but the scriptures also seem to suggest that any kind of adultery or anything like that is wrong. And so I'm not going to sit here and tell you what you're doing is wrong, but what I do want to do is I want to tell you about Jesus, and I want to introduce you to Jesus. And then you can come to the conclusion of what Jesus actually says. And so I shifted the conversation away from that to even really responding, because I didn't want to respond and say, well, I think it's wrong, because I don't think it's wrong because I just want to think it's wrong. I think it's wrong because the scriptures seem to suggest that it's wrong. And so I'm rather than taking the brunt of that claim, I put it on Jesus because Jesus can take it, right? And I focused on Jesus. And the end of the conversation, I remember he stood up and I said, but no matter what, I said, I want you to know that I love you, and I want to see you have a right relationship with Jesus. And he stood up and gave me a hug. And he said he wasn't expecting a response like that. And then we had conversations about abortion and all this stuff. But it was the conversations. I didn't hinder from the truth, but I was gentle about it, and I explained to him why I believe in what Jesus says, and he didn't change. He's still doing what he wants to do, and I don't know what his relationship with Jesus is like today, but all I could do is plant that seed, and I at least showed him that I can still love him and hold to the truth. Just because we object with people doesn't mean that we don't love them. In fact, the whole purpose of us sharing the gospel is because we love them, right? How unloving is it for us to know the truth and to just let them do what they want to do and never share it with them, right? I hope that helps.